The land was dying, the cattle were starving, and Silas Montgomery carried a secret darker than the Kansas dust itself. Then one day, a mysterious widow arrived at his ranch with eyes sharp enough to cut through every lie he had ever told. What began as survival soon became a reckoning between guilt, justice, and forgiveness. In a world where most men reached for a gun, she chose something far more dangerous: mercy. Stay with this story to the very last moment.
1878. Oak Haven, Kansas. The sky was a pale, dusty yellow. It hadn't rained since April. The dirt in the streets was baked hard as iron. People were hungry, real hungry. You could see it in the way the horses stood, heads hanging low. You could see it in the hollowed-out faces of the townsfolk. Silas Cal Montgomery stood on the warped boardwalk outside the general store. He held a rusted tack in one hand, a piece of paper in the other. He pressed the paper to the post and pushed the tack home with his thumb. Farmhand wanted room, board, and $5 a month. $5, that was all he had left. $5, a dying ranch, and a whole lot of regret. He used to be somebody, a U.S. Marshal, a man who brought order to chaos. Now, he was just a ghost, a disgraced man holding a secret that ate at him every night. People in Oak Haven knew his face, and they crossed the street to avoid it. Down the road, the noon stagecoach rolled in. It dragged a cloud of dust behind it, like a heavy cape. The horses blew hard as the driver hauled back on the reins. The door creaked open. A woman stepped out, Clara Boone, 38 years old. Her travel dress was faded, worn thin at the elbows. She carried a single canvas bag. Her pockets were empty. But she didn't hunch. She didn't cower. She stood tall, taking in the desolate street with clear, steady eyes. She took 3 steps toward the mercantile. Then she stopped. There, near the dried-up water trough, lay a dog, just a stray, ribs pushing sharp against matted, dust-colored fur. But it was the back leg that caught the eye. It was mangled, crushed by a steel jaw trap that someone had carelessly left out. The dog was breathing shallow, barely hanging on. Clara dropped her bag. She went to her knees in the dirt. She reached out a hand. The dog didn't snarl. It didn't flinch. It just looked at her with tired, cloudy eyes. Footsteps, heavy and dragging. A drifter stopped behind her. Gaunt face, hungry, desperate eyes. He looked at the dog, then at Clara. He reached into a dirty coat pocket, tossed 2 silver coins into the dust, clink. "Sell me that mutt," the man said. His voice was like dry leaves scraping together. "I'll skin it for the pelt. And the meat, well, it's enough to stew up. Keep my family alive another week. 2 coins. It's a fair trade for a dying thing." Clara didn't look at the money. She stood up. Slowly, she turned and placed herself squarely between the hungry man and the bleeding animal. She didn't yell. She didn't have to. "No. Lady, look around," the drifter sneered, stepping closer. "Times are hard. People are starving. Be reasonable. It's just a dog." Clara didn't blink. She lifted her chin, her voice ringing out, clear and sharp, across the quiet street. "A living creature's life, even a crippled one, is not something you bargain for to fill your stomach," Clara said. The drifter stopped. "Respecting life is the last boundary keeping us human in starving times," she continued, her words falling heavy and absolute. "When we start weighing the value of a breathing soul against our own hunger, we lose whatever makes us decent. I don't care how desperate things get. I would rather starve myself than sell a life for food." In the shadows of the store awning, Cal Montgomery froze. He heard every word. They hit him like a physical blow to the chest. Respecting life is the last boundary. He had crossed that boundary. Years ago, he traded an innocent man's life to protect his own badge. The guilt was a heavy, rotting thing in his gut. He looked at the woman, standing penniless in the dirt, defending a broken animal with nothing but her own unyielding morality. Cal stepped off the boardwalk, his spurs as jingled a soft, metallic chime in the dead air. He walked over to the drifter. He didn't rush. He didn't draw the iron at his hip. He just bent down, picked up the 2 silver coins, and pressed them hard into the drifter's chest. "Move along," Cal said. It was just a whisper, but it had the old martial steel in it, the kind of cold edge that made men reconsider their choices. The drifter looked into Cal's dead flat eyes. He swallowed hard, snatched his money, walked away without a backward glance. Cal turned to Clara. He looked at her proud, dusty face. Then he looked down at the shivering dog. Finally, he looked at her empty canvas bag. "Got a ranch," Cal said, his voice rough. "East of town, ground is hard, work is harder. I need a hand." He paused. "Pays $5 a month. Includes room and board." Clara studied him, saw the scars. She saw the shadows in his eyes. "Does the board include the dog?" she asked. Cal looked at the crippled animal again. He thought about boundaries. He thought about decency. "It does," Cal said. Clara nodded once. "Then I'm hired." Morning came to the Montgomery ranch not with a shout, but with a slow, gray bleed across the prairie. The wind had died down during the night. The silence left behind was heavy. It rang in your ears. Cal Montgomery was up before the sun, same as always. He pulled his boots on in the dark. Stiff leather, worn heels. The floorboards groaned under his weight. He walked into the small kitchen. Stopped. There was a fire in the stove. A small one. Careful. Saving wood. The smell of boiling coffee and toasted cornmeal hung in the air. Clara was already at the counter. She had her sleeves rolled up past her elbows. Her hands were dusted with flour. She didn't look up when he walked in, just kept working the dough. In the corner, near the warmth of the iron stove, lay Buster. The dog was a bag of bones and matted fur. His crushed back leg was wrapped in clean, white linen. Clara's petticoat, Cal reckoned. Buster lifted his head, thumped his scrawny tail once against the floorboards. Just once. It was a start. Cal poured a cup of coffee. Black, bitter. He leaned against the doorframe, watched her. "You don't have to be up this early," Cal said. His voice was gravel. "First words of the day. Daylight burns just the same for a woman as it does a man," Clara said. She turned, wiping her hands on a rag. She pointed to a tin plate on the table. "Eat. You can work a dying ranch on an empty stomach," Cal said. He ate. The food was simple, but it tasted like someone actually cared about it. He didn't say thank you. He wasn't used to it. He just stood up, grabbed his worn leather gloves, and headed for the door. "Barn needs mucking," Cal said, not looking back. "Stay clear of the brindle cow. She kicks." The sun was fully over the horizon by the time they made it to the barn. The heat was already rising, baking the smell of old manure and dry dust into the air. Cal had 3 head of cattle left. That was it. Last winter had taken 5. The bank had taken the rest. These 3 were skinny, skittish. Their ribs showed through their dull hides. They smelled the dry wind and knew the grass was dead. It made them mean. It made them restless. Cal grabbed at a heavy hemp rope. He walked into the first stall. The brindle cow shifted, tossing her heavy head. Her hooves clattered against the dry wooden planks. "Easy," Cal barked. He threw the rope over her neck. The cow pulled back, eyes rolling white. Cal grunted. He planted his boots in the dirt and yanked the rope hard. He pulled the halter tight, cinching it up high and harsh against the animal. His throat forced her head down. The cow let out a choked, panicked sound. She fought the rope, choking herself against the post. "Stand still." "Damn you," Cal muttered, tying a harsh knot, pulling the slack with a violent jerk. He turned around. Clara was standing right behind him. She wasn't holding a pitchfork. She wasn't looking at the muck on the floor. She was looking dead at him. Her eyes were like chips of flint. Without a word, Clara walked past him. She stepped right up to the brindle cow. The animal shifted, nervous. Clara didn't flinch. She raised a steady, slow hand. She had rested it on the cow's sweaty neck. Just left it there. A quiet, firm weight. The cow stopped thrashing. Clara reached up. She untied Cal's harsh, biting knot. She loosened the rope around the throat. She slipped the halter down, resting the pressure across the thick shoulders instead of the windpipe. She tied a loose, secure bowline. The cow took a deep, shuddering breath. It lowered its head, began to chew on a stray bit of dry hay. Cal felt his jaw tighten. A hot prickle of pride flared in his chest. "What do you think you're doing?" Cal asked. His voice was low, dangerous. The tone that used to make outlaws empty their holsters. They're dumb beasts. They need to know who's boss. You give them slack, they'll drag you across the yard. Clara turned around. She didn't back up. She met his gaze squarely in the dusty light of the barn. "No, Mr. Montgomery," Clara said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the heavy air like a knife. "That is where you are entirely wrong." She took a step toward him. "The right to be treated with decency doesn't depend on whether you're a man or a beast," Clara stated, emphasizing every single word. "It doesn't depend on how much power you hold over them. When you use violence or when you use unnecessary force against something that is weaker than you are not demonstrating your authority. You are losing your core self-respect." Cal stared at her. The barn was dead quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "It's livestock," Cal argued, though the fire had gone out of his voice. "It's a life," Claire corrected him immediately. "And how you treat the lowest, most defenseless life in your care is the exact measure of your own humanity. You choke that animal because you are frustrated with this route, because you are frustrated with your debts. You took your lack of control out on a creature that cannot fight back. That isn't leadership. That is cruelty." She didn't blink. "If we are going to work this land together," Clara continued, her voice ringing clear in the dusty space, "you need to understand something. Brutality does not earn loyalty. Not from a dog, not from a cow, and certainly not from a person. If you want this ranch to survive, you start by respecting the lives that are bleeding into this dirt right alongside you." Cal stood frozen. Her words hit him deep, hard. They bypassed his pride and struck right at the rotten core of his guilt. He thought of Arthur Boone. He thought of a man locked in a cell, unable to fight back, while Cal used his badge to choke the life out of him. You took your lack of control out on a creature that cannot fight back. Cal looked at the cow. It was breathing easy now, standing calm. He looked down at his own thick, calloused hands. Hands that had built things. Hands that had destroyed things. He didn't have an argument. He didn't have a defense. Because she was right. And it terrified him to realize how easily he had slipped into the habit of cruelty just because it was easy, just because he was hurting. Hell, Cal swallowed. Hard. He nodded. Once. A sharp, jerky motion. "All right," Cal said quietly. He walked over to the next stall, the red roan steer. Cal picked up the rope. He didn't throw it. He walked up slow. He placed a hand on the steer's flank. He slid the halter over the head, gently. He tied a loose knot across the shoulders. The steer didn't fight. It just stood there. Clara watched him. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just picked up a pitchfork and got to work. They worked the rest of the morning in silence. But it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence from the morning. It was a working silence, a thinking silence. When they walked back to the house for the midday meal, Buster dragged himself out onto the porch. He whined. He looked up at Cal. Cal stopped. He looked at the crippled dog. He remembered the anger from the morning. He remembered the lesson. Slowly, Cal reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small scrap of dried beef he'd saved from breakfast. He didn't toss it in the dirt. He knelt down. He held it out in his flat palm. Buster leaned forward, sniffed. Then, gently, the dog took the meat. Cal stood up. He caught Clara looking at him from the doorway. He tipped his hat, just a fraction of an inch, and walked inside. The rules of the ranch had changed. And for the first time in years, Cal felt like he could look at himself in the mirror without looking away. 3 days passed. The drought didn't break. The sun hung in the sky like a copper penny, burning everything it touched. The Montgomery Ranch was dying of thirst, but it was also dying of rot. The barn roof was a disaster. Years of neglect, harsh winters, and blistering summers had curled the cedar shingles. Several boards were completely rotted through. If by some miracle it did rain, the water would pour right through and ruin what little feed Cal had left. It was 2 in the afternoon, the hottest part of the day. Heat shimmered off the hard-pan dirt like water. Cal walked out of the tool shed, dragging a heavy wooden extension ladder. He was sweating right through his flannel shirt. He dropped the ladder against the side of the barn. Thud. A cloud of dust puffed up around his boots. He carried out a heavy canvas sack of iron nails and a steel-headed hammer. He set them at the base of the ladder. He took off his hat, wiped his forehead with his forearm, and looked up at the steep, dangerous pitch of the roof. The screen door of the house whined on its hinges. Clara stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing a faded cotton shirt, tucked into a heavy canvas skirt. She had tied her hair back with a piece of twine. She carried a leather pouch strapped around her waist. She walked across the yard. The sun beat down on her, but her stride was steady. She stopped at the base of the ladder. She looked at the nails. She looked at Cal. "I'll take the high ridge," Clara said flatly. "You start on the lower eaves. We'll meet in the middle." Cal frowned. He stepped between her and the ladder. He crossed his arms over his broad chest. "No," Cal said. "You won't." Clara looked at him. "The roof needs patching. 2 hands are faster than one." "It's a steep pitch. The wood is rotten," Cal countered. He gestured to the house. "Go back inside. Stay in the shade, mend clothes. Start supper. Roofing isn't a job for a woman. It's too dangerous." "I'll handle the heavy lifting," he said it like it was a fact of nature, like the sky being blue or the dirt being dry. In his world, in 1878, men broke their backs in the sun, and women stayed inside the walls. That was the order of things. Clara didn't flinch. She didn't yell. Instead, she stepped right around him. She grabbed the sides of the heavy wooden ladder. She put her boot on the first rung. "Clara," Cal warned, his voice dropping an octave. "Get down, now." Clara stopped on the second rung. She didn't climb down. She turned her head and looked down at him. "Listen to me very carefully, Cal," Clara said. Her voice was steady, anchored in absolute conviction. "Equality doesn't mean I force you to do less. It means you allow me to shoulder an equal share of the burden." Cal scowled. "You could fall, you could break your neck. It's a man's work." "Female frailty is a myth," Clara stated, her words sharp and clear. "It is a lie the society invented to keep us manageable, to keep us dependent, to make us believe we are too weak to build, too weak to lead, and too weak to survive without a man standing in front of us." She pointed up at the rotting roof. "The sun doesn't care if I wear a skirt or trousers. The nails drive into the wood exactly the same. I have survived grief. I have survived starvation, and I have survived crossing this God-forsaken country alone. I am not a delicate flower that will wilt in the sun. Cal stood at the bottom of the ladder, his mouth set in a hard line. He was a man of his time, raised on the gospel of protecting women. But as he looked at her, he didn't see someone who needed protecting. He saw iron. I am not asking for your permission to work, Clara said directly to him. I am telling you the terms of my being here. On this roof, on this ranch, I am your partner, not your dependent, not someone who needs protecting. If we are going to save this place, we save it as equals. We sweat the same, we bleed the same, and we build the same. She held his gaze for 3 long seconds, waiting for him to argue, waiting for him to try and pull her down. Cal looked at her calloused hands gripping the ladder. He remembered her standing down a starving man over a crippled dog. He remembered the fierce, unwavering light in her eyes. He let out a long, slow breath. The stubborn set of his shoulders relaxed. The wood near the chimney is soft, Cal said quietly. Step on the nails, not the center of the shingles. Clara gave a single, firm nod. Understood. She climbed the ladder all the way to the top. She swung herself onto the steep pitch of the roof. Her boots find purchase on the dry cedar. Cal watched her for a moment. Then he picked up his hammer, grabbed a handful of nails, and climbed up after her. They worked for 4 hours. The heat was brutal. It baked the moisture right out of their lungs. The dry cedar shingles splintered. Hammers rang out against iron nails in a steady, rhythmic beat. Thwack, thwack, thwack. Cal worked the lower section. Every time he looked up, fully expecting her to be resting or struggling, she was working. Her face was streaked with sweat and dirt. She had a nail clamped between her teeth, her hammer swinging in a smooth, practiced arc. She didn't complain. She didn't slow down. She just did the work. About 2 hours in, Cal ran out of nails in his apron. He patted his empty pockets, annoyed. He looked down at the canvas sack sitting on the dirt, 20 feet below. He sighed, getting ready to make the long climb down. Here, a voice said. Cal looked up. Clara was sliding down the pitch of the roof toward him. She reached into her leather waist pouch and pulled out a heavy handful of iron nails. She held them out to him. Cal looked at the nails, then he looked at her. There was no superiority in her face. No, I told you so. Just a partner, handing over supplies to get the job done. Cal reached out. His thick, scarred fingers brushed against her knuckles as he took the nails. Much obliged, Cal muttered. Keep your hammer angled down on the left side, Clara pointed out casually. The wind comes from the west. You want the shingles overlapping tight against the draft. Cal looked at the shingles he had just laid. She was right. He adjusted his grip. Good eye. By the time the sun began to dip low in the west, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and burnt orange, the roof was patched. They climbed down the ladder in silence. Their muscles ached. Their hands were covered in pitch and splinters. They were exhausted, bone-tired in a way that goes deeper than the flesh. Cal walked over to the water pump. He grabbed the iron handle and pumped it. The water came out a slow, rusty trickle, then ran clear. He cupped his hands, splashed the cold water over his face, and drank deep. He stepped back. He didn't walk away. He stood by the pump and waited. Clara walked over. She was breathing hard, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. She stepped up to the pump. Cal reached out and took the iron handle. He pumped the water for her. It was a small gesture. Tiny, but in the language of Silas Montgomery, it was massive. He wasn't doing it because she was a fragile woman who couldn't pump her own water. He was doing it because she was his partner, because she had held her own, because she had earned her place on the high ground. Clara cupped her hands and drank. She splashed water on her neck. She looked up at him. "Good work today," Cal said. His voice was quiet, level, respectful. "We got it done," Clara agreed. They walked back to the house side by side. Cal didn't walk in front of her. He didn't walk behind her. He matched her stride, dust for dusty step. The boundaries that society had built between them, the walls of frailty and dominance, had been left behind on a rotting roof. They were standing on level ground now. And for Cal, looking at the fierce, capable woman walking next to him, the view was finally starting to make sense. The heat didn't break. It just settled. It pressed down on the Oakhaven Valley like a heavy wool blanket. The grass turned from yellow to a dead, brittle gray. Cal and Clara were in the yard. They were fixing a length of broken fence, working in tandem now, a quiet rhythm. Cal drove the post. Clara strung the wire. Buster lay in the thin shade of the porch, panting, watching them with one eye open. Then the dog's ears twitched. A low growl rattled in his throat. Cal paused. He rested his heavy hammer on the top of the fence post. He looked down the long, dusty driveway. A buggy was coming. It wasn't a farm wagon. It didn't rattle. It rolled smooth, pulled by a pair of matched black geldings. The paint on the buggy was shiny and black, completely out of place, in a world painted in dust. Cal felt his stomach tighten. He knew that buggy. "Go inside," Cal said. He didn't look at Clara. He just kept his eyes on the approaching horses. Clara wiped her brow with the back of her wrist. She looked at the buggy. Then she looked at Cal. "I don't hide from company," Clara said. "That ain't company," Cal replied. His voice was grim. "That S the bank." The buggy pulled to a stop near the water pump. The horses tossed their heads, their bits jingling. A man stepped down. Harrison Vance. He was 52, dressed in a tailored gray suit. A gold watch chain looped across his vest. He took off his bowler hat and wiped his forehead with a clean white handkerchief. He looked around the dying ranch. His nose wrinkled, just a fraction, like he smelled something rotten. "Montgomery," Vance said. His voice was smooth, too smooth, like oiled glass. "Vance?" Cal nodded. He didn't offer his hand. He stepped forward, putting himself between the banker and the house. "Hot day for heavy labor," Vance observed. He looked at the broken fence. Then he looked at the 3 bony cows standing in the far corral. "Doesn't look like much is paying off, though." "I manage," Cal said. Vance sighed. He put his hat back on. "I'm a man of business, Cal. I don't like making this drive. It's dirty. It's unpleasant. But I have a board of directors, and they have expectations." Vance reached into his inside coat pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. $340, due by the end of the month. Cal stared at the paper. It might as well have been a loaded gun. "I need an extension," Cal said quietly. It took everything he had to say those words, to beg. "You've had an extension," Vance replied. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You have no cash. Your herd is gone. This land is drying up and blowing away. But there is a solution." Cal narrowed his eyes. "I'm listening." "The east parcel," Vance said. He pointed toward the far ridge, the only part of the ranch that still held a few stubborn, deep-rooted cottonwood trees. 80 acres. Sign it over to the bank. We forgive the 340. We'll call it square." Cal's jaw clenched. "That's the best grazing land I have. If it ever rains again, that's the only place the grass will hold." "It's not going to rain, Cal," Vance said smoothly. "And frankly, men like you know how to manage capital anyway. You dirt farmers, you let nature dictate your lives. You lack the discipline for true enterprise. Poverty isn't an accident, Montgomery. It's a symptom of laziness. Men with empty pockets usually have empty heads to match. Cal's hands balled into fists. He stepped forward. The old marshal in him wanted to drag Vance through the dirt. Before Cal could move, the screen door banged shut. Clara stepped off the porch. She walked straight toward them. Her boots kicked up small clouds of dust. She didn't look at Cal. She locked her eyes right on Harrison Vance. Vance looked at her, amused. A hired girl in a dusty skirt. Clara stopped 2 feet from the banker. She stood tall. "Mr. Vance," Clara said. Her voice rang out clear and sharp in the dead air. "Holding money does not give you the right to trample on another person's dignity." Vance's amused smile faltered. He blinked. "Excuse me, I said what I meant," Clara continued, not backing down an inch. "Poverty during a drought is a natural disaster. It is not a moral failing for you to pass judgment on." She pointed a finger at his chest. "This man has broken his back trying to keep this land alive. You sit in a brick building and collect interest on his sweat. That is business. But do not confuse your business with superiority. Capitalism does not grant you the right to crush the humanity of the people who feed this country. Wealth is not a measure of a man's worth, and poverty is not a measure of his sins." Cal stood frozen. He had never heard anyone speak to Vance like that, let alone a woman, not in Oak Haven, not anywhere. His face flushed a dull, angry red. He opened his mouth to snap back, but then he stopped. He really looked at Clara. He looked at the shape of her jaw, the intense, intelligent fire in her eyes. The banker's mind turned over, flipping through files and ledgers and names. Vance tilted his head. The anger in his face melted into something cold, something calculating. "Well," Vance said softly, "I'll be damned." Clara didn't flinch. "You have a very sharp tongue, madam," Vance said, a slow, knowing smile creeping back onto his face. "Very articulate. Not exactly the vocabulary of a drifting farmhand." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I handled the estate auction, you know, up in Missouri, after the unfortunate business with the federal court." Cal felt a cold spike of adrenaline hit his blood. Missouri, federal court. Clara's face went completely blank, a perfect, unreadable mask. "Your husband had a similar fire," Vance murmured. "Look where it got him." Clara didn't say a word. She just stared right through him. Vance turned back to Cal. He tipped his hat. "End of the month, Montgomery. $340. Or the deed to the east parcel. Have a pleasant afternoon." Vance climbed back into his buggy. He took the reins. He looked back at Clara one last time, a mocking smile on his lips, and drove away. The dust settled. The silence rushed back in, heavy, suffocating. Cal looked at Clara. She was still staring down the road. Her hands were trembling, just slightly. "Missouri," Cal said. His voice was hollow. Clara closed her eyes. She took a deep breath. She opened them, but she didn't look at him. She turned and walked back toward the house. "We have fencing to finish," she said. Cal didn't follow her. He stood in the yard for a long, long time. The wind picked up, blowing dry dirt against his boots. A seed of doubt had been planted. And in the dry, cracked earth of Cal Montgomery's mind, it was already starting to take root. The sun went down, but the heat stayed. Cal couldn't eat. He couldn't sit still. The silence in the small house was deafening. Clara was reading a book by the light of a single kerosene lamp. Buster was asleep at her feet. It looked peaceful. It felt like a lie. "I handled the estate auction. Missouri, federal court." The words echoed in Cal's head, over and over, beating against his skull like a hammer. He needed to move. He needed to work. Cal grabbed a lantern off the hook by the door. "Going to the shed," he muttered. "Need to sort the old tackle." Clara turned a page. "Don't stay up too late." Cal walked out into the dark. The tool shed was a lean-to built off the back of the barn. It was cramped. It smelled like mouse droppings, dry rot, and old leather. He set the lantern on a dusty workbench. He started pulling things off the shelves. Broken bridles, rusted horseshoes, empty liniment bottles. Mindless work, moving things from one pile to another just to keep his hands busy. At the back of the bottom shelf, behind a stack of rotten burlap sacks, he found a box. It was a tin lockbox, heavy, coated in years of dust. Cal pulled it out. He set it on the bench under the yellow light of the lantern. The latch wasn't locked. It was rusted shut. Cal grabbed a flathead screwdriver and wedged it under the hasp. He hit it with the heel of his hand. Snap. The rust broke. The lid popped open. Inside, there was no money, no valuables. Just a few personal effects left behind by a man who had rented the east parcel years ago before Cal bought the whole spread. A shaving razor, a pocket watch with a cracked crystal face, and a thick, folded piece of parchment. Cal picked up the parchment. It felt heavy, important. He unfolded it carefully. The paper was brittle. It was a map, a hand-drawn topographical map of the Montgomery Ranch, specifically the east parcel. The land Vance wanted so badly. Cal leaned closer to the lantern. His eyes scanned the intricate lines. There were geological notes written in a precise, educated script, markings of limestone deposits, elevations. And right in the center of the east parcel, circled in red ink, was a note, artesian pressure indicator, subsurface aquifer, massive volume, water, an ocean of it trapped beneath the dry rock. If this map was right, the east parcel wasn't just grazing land. It was the key to saving the entire county. Vance knew. That's why the bank wanted it. Cal's eyes drifted to the bottom right corner of the map, to the signature. He stopped breathing. The lantern light flickered. Cal's hands began to shake, the heavy, calloused hands of a U.S. Marshal trembled like leaves in the wind. Arthur Boone, October 1874. Arthur Boone, the man Cal had arrested in Missouri. The man Cal had sworn on a Bible was running stolen cattle. The man who died of fever in a federal penitentiary because of Cal's perjured testimony. Cal stared at the name. The air in the shed vanished. He couldn't pull a breath into his lungs. He dropped the map. He stumbled backward, his shoulders hitting the wooden wall of the shed. Your husband had a similar fire. Clara Boone, the widow. She was sleeping under his roof, cooking his meals, healing his dog. She hadn't come for a job. She had come for him. Cal didn't sleep that night. He sat in the dirt of the shed until the sun came up. At first light, he saddled his horse. He didn't tell Clara where he was going. He rode hard into Oak Haven. He went straight to the telegraph office. He wired the federal clerk in Missouri, an old contact, someone who owed him a favor. He waited 3 hours, drinking black coffee that tasted like ash. The wire came back at noon. Arthur Boone Estate settled 1876. Widow Clara Boone inherited substantial family trust, independent wealth, whereabouts unknown. She wasn't poor. She didn't need $5 a month. She didn't need room and board. She was a wealthy woman who had dressed in rags to stand in the dirt of his dying ranch. Cal folded the telegram. He put it in his pocket. He rode back to the ranch. The sun was sinking when he tied his horse to the rail. Clara was on the porch. She had a basin of water and was washing the dust off her hands. Buster sat beside her, his tail giving a soft thump against the floorboards. Cal walked up the steps. His boots sounded heavy, like a man walking to the gallows. He stopped in front of her. He reached into his shirt. He pulled out the map. He laid it flat on the small wooden table on the porch. Clara looked down. She saw the red circle. She saw the signature. She dried her hands on a towel. She didn't gasp. She didn't look away. She just folded the towel and set it down. You found it, Clara said. Her voice was perfectly calm. You're Arthur Boone's wife, Cal said. It wasn't a question. It was a sentence. I am. Cal looked at her. He waited for the anger. He waited for her to pull a gun or a knife or to scream at him for what he had done. He braced himself for the hatred. He welcomed it. He deserved it. But Clara just looked at him with a deep, tragic sadness. Why? Cal asked. His voice cracked. Why are you here? To watch me starve? To watch me lose everything? Is that it? Revenge? Clara shook her head slowly. Arthur didn't want revenge, and neither do I. Cal stepped back. He ran a shaking hand through his hair. The guilt, the unbearable, crushing weight of the guilt, finally broke through his chest. He couldn't hold it anymore. The stoic cowboy, the tough lawman, it all shattered. He looked at the ground. He couldn't look at her face. I lied, Cal whispered. The words tore his throat on the way out. I lied on the stand. I know, Clara said softly. Cal's head snapped up. Tears, hot and bitter, blurred his vision. They had me, Clara, Cal said, his voice raw, bleeding the brass. The corrupt marshals working for the cattle barons. They found out about a mistake I made years ago. A bribe I took when I was young and stupid. They put a gun to my head. They said either I testify that Arthur was running the rustlers, or they'd ruin me. They'd hang me. He hit his own chest with his fist hard. I used to think I was the law, Cal said, tears spilting down his dusty cheeks. I wore that badge like a shield. I thought because I had a star on my chest, everything I did was right. He looked at her, his soul completely bare. But the law isn't always justice, stated, his voice ringing with a terrible clarity. Sometimes the law is just a weapon, used by the strong to break the weak. When I sat in that chair, when I traded Arthur's freedom to protect my own badge, my own reputation, I betrayed the most fundamental human right, the right to a fair truth, the right to freedom. I stole his life to buy my own. Cal fell to his knees on the hard wooden porch. A broken man. I am a coward, Cal wept. I killed a good man, and there isn't enough dirt in Kansas to bury what I've done. Clara stood above him. She looked down at the man who had destroyed her life. She saw his agony. She saw the total collapse of his pride. She didn't reach out to touch him. Not yet. Arthur knew, Clara said, her voice cutting through the twilight. He sat in that courtroom, and he looked at your face. He told me, before he died, that you looked like a man with a noose around your own neck. Cal looked up, his face slick with tears. He knew? He knew you were forced, Clara said firmly. He didn't excuse it. He didn't absolve you. What you did was a profound violation of his human rights. You treated him as collateral damage for your own survival. She stepped closer. But Arthur also knew that carrying hatred is a poison, Clara said. He asked me to find you, not to punish you. The guilt is already doing that. Cal stared at her. Then why? To see if there was a man left underneath all that guilt, Clara answered, her voice steady and resolute. To see if you were capable of understanding the value of a life after you had thrown one away. Because if we don't believe that people can learn, that they can change, and that they can ultimately choose justice over fear, then Arthur died for absolutely nothing. Buster whined softly. The dog limped forward and pushed his wet nose against Cal's trembling hand. Cal looked at the dog. He looked at the map. He looked at the widow of the man he had wronged. The night was fully dark now. But for the first time in 4 years, Cal Montgomery felt like he was finally seeing the light. The heat finally broke. It didn't surrender quietly. It went out violently. Midnight brought the storm. It rolled in from the west, a wall of black clouds swallowing the stars. Lightning spider-webbed across the sky. The thunder didn't crack. It rumbled. Deep and low, it rattled the tin roof of the house. It shook the floorboards. Then came the rain. It hit the parched earth like buckshot. Hard, driving sheets of water. The dry dirt soaked it up, turning the dust into a thick, sweet-smelling mud. The smell of ozone and wet sagebrush poured through the cracks in the window frames. Cal lay on his cot in the back room. He was fully dressed. He hadn't taken off his boots. He hadn't slept a wink. His chest felt hollow, scraped clean. The secret was out. The poison he had carried for 4 years was finally out in the open. Clara knew. She had always known. She had looked at the man who killed her husband, eaten his food, fixed his roof, and she hadn't put a bullet in his back. He stared at the ceiling in the dark. A flash of lightning lit up the room for a split second. In that brief flash, Cal realized something terrifying. He was forgiven, not by the law, not by God, but by the woman who mattered most, and somehow that grace was heavier than the guilt had ever been. It demanded something of him. It demanded that he stop hiding. Another roll of thunder shook the house. Beneath the sound of the storm, Cal heard something else. It was faint. It was muffled. But in the quiet space between the thunder, it was unmistakable. Crying. It wasn't a loud wail. It was a broken, ragged sound. The sound of someone trying desperately to hold themselves together and failing. The sound of a dam finally giving way. Cal sat up. He swung his legs over the side of the cot. His boots hit the floor. His first instinct was the old instinct. Walk away. Give her privacy. Men didn't interfere with a woman's tears. It was easier to pretend you didn't hear. It was easier to let people suffer in the dark. But Cal remembered his own words from the porch. I used to think I was the law. I traded his freedom to protect myself. Walking away was protecting himself. It was the coward's way out. Cal stood up. He walked down the short, narrow hallway. The floorboards creaked under his weight, but the rain drowned out the sound. He reached Clara's door. It was cracked open an inch. A faint yellow glow from a turned-down oil lamp spilled into the hall. Cal pushed the door. Slowly. Clara was on the floor. She was sitting with her back pressed against the side of the iron bed frame. Her knees were pulled towards her chest. Her head was bowed. She was shaking. In her hand, crumpled and stained with tears, was a piece of paper, a letter. The handwriting was faint. Est's letter. Buster was there, too. The dog was lying right beside her, his chin resting softly on the hem of her skirt. He was whining, a low, anxious sound in his throat. He didn't know how to fix it, but he refused to leave her side. Cal stood in the doorway. He felt massive, awkward, clumsy. Clara looked up. Her eyes were red. Her face was soaked. The fierce, unbreakable woman who had stood down a banker and climbed a rotting roof was gone. She was just a widow, a woman who missed her husband so much it was tearing her apart from the inside out. She quickly wiped her face with the back of her wrist. She tried to straighten her spine. She tried to put the armor back on. I'm sorry, Clara choked out. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. The thunder, it woke me. I'll be quiet. I'm sorry. Cal felt a sharp ache in his chest. He walked into the room. He didn't stand over her. He didn't offer a hand to pull her up. He didn't tell her to stop crying. Cal lowered his heavy frame to the floor. He crossed his legs. He sat down right across from her, just 2 feet away. Clara stared at him. She clutched the letter to her chest. Don't apologize, Cal said. His voice was a low, steady rumble, like the thunder outside, but without the danger. I didn't mean to wake you, she whispered, looking down at her hands. I know how to be strong, I do. But sometimes, in the dark, the quiet gets too loud, and I just miss him. It's not fair. None of it is fair. Cal nodded slowly. He didn't reach out to pat her hand. He didn't offer empty comforts. He looked her right in the eye. "I'm not going to tell you it's going to be all right," Cal said plainly, "and I'm not going to ask you to stop crying." Clara looked up, surprised. Cal leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. He needed her to hear this. He needed her to understand that he wasn't running away anymore. "I have no right to ask you to forget your pain," Cal stated. He spoke the words clearly, deliberately. "For years, I made my living telling people to move on, telling victims that the law had handled it, so they needed to dry their eyes and go home. I was wrong." He pointed a thick, scarred finger at the letter against her chest. "Healing doesn't mean erasing the wound," Cal said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had finally learned the truth. "Doesn't mean pretending the terrible thing didn't happen. Healing means having the courage to let that wound breathe. It means dragging it out into the light and admitting that it hurts. You lost a good man. You lost him to corruption. You lost him to my cowardice." Clara's breath hitched. She gripped the letter tighter. Cal held her gaze. He didn't flinch away from the pain in her eyes. He anchored himself to it. "You have every right to be furious," Cal told her, his voice firm and unwavering. "You have every right to scream and cry and hate the world for what it took from you. And it is my responsibility to sit here and face that fury. Not to fix it, not to make excuses, but to bear witness to it. Because ignoring another person's suffering is just another form of violence." The room went quiet. The rain lashed against the glass of the window, a steady, rhythmic drumming. Clara stared at the rugged, broken cowboy sitting on the floor in front of her. He wasn't defending himself. He wasn't shrinking from his guilt. He was offering her the one thing nobody else had offered her since Arthur died, the permission to be broken. "Everybody in Missouri told me to be a brave widow," Clara said, her voice trembling. The tears started falling again, but she didn't wipe them away this time. "The judge, the pastor, the neighbors. They told me to pray on it. They told me to pack my bags, sell the house, and start over. Nobody wanted to see me angry. Nobody wanted to see me cry. It made them uncomfortable. People want the pain to be quiet so they don't have to look at it." Cal agreed quietly. "It's selfish." "I held it in," Clara whispered. She looked down at the letter. "I held it in until my bones ached. I had to be the strong one. I had to be the one who survived. I had to come out here and find you. Sure, Arthur's last wish was honored. I couldn't break down. If I broke down, I thought I might never get back up." "You can break down here," Cal said. He didn't say it with pity. He said it with absolute certainty. "You don't have to carry the armor in this house." Cal continued, his voice rough but gentle. "You are entitled to your grief. It is yours. You earned it with the love you had for him, and I am not afraid of it." Clara let out a sob. It was a deep, gut-wrenching sound. The sound of years of forced strength finally cracking open. She leaned forward. She buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook violently. The grief poured out of her, raw and unfiltered. Cal didn't panic. He didn't try to shush her. He just sat there, solid, unmoving, a grounding force in the middle of her storm. Buster whined. The dog stood up. He limped forward, crossing the small distance between them. Buster nudged his head under Clara's arm. Then the dog stretched his long, bony body out, resting his back against Cal S.'s knee while keeping his head on Clara S.'s lap, a physical bridge between two broken people. Cal rested his heavy hand on Buster S.'s back. He felt the rise and fall of the dog S. breathing. After a long time, the sobbing began to slow. The ragged edges of Clara's breathing started to smooth out. The storm outside was shifting too. The thunder was moving further east. The rain was settling into a steady, quiet drizzle. Clara slowly lifted her head. Her face was exhausted, but the frantic, panicked tension in her jaw was gone. She wiped her cheeks with the back of her hands. She looked at Cal. He was still right there. He hadn't moved an inch. "I look a fright," she whispered, a small, tired breath of a laugh escaping her lips. "You look human," Cal said. Clara looked down at Buster. She stroked the dog's soft ears. Her fingers brushed against Cal's knuckles where his hand rested on the dog's back. Neither of them pulled away. "Thank you," Clara said softly. "I didn't do anything," Cal replied. "Yes, you did." Clara corrected him. Her voice was steadying now, gaining back its natural rhythm. "You stayed. You didn't tell me to get over it. You didn't make my grief about your guilt." She looked up, meeting his eyes in the dim lantern light. "There is a difference between apology and true accountability," Clara said. It wasn't a rebuke. It was a realization. An apology is just words to make the guilty party feel better. Accountability is sitting in the dark with the person you hurt. It's letting them be angry. It's honoring their right to feel the pain you caused. Cal nodded slowly. He understood exactly what she meant. "I'm accountable, Clara. To you, to Arthur, to this land. I spent 4 years running from the truth because I thought it would kill me. But the lying was what was killing me. I'm done running." Clara studied his face. She saw the lines of exhaustion. She saw the gray in his beard. But she also saw something that hadn't been there when she first arrived. She saw a man who had finally put down his badge and picked up his conscience. "I think the worst of the storm is over," Clara said. She wasn't just talking about the weather. Cal knew that. "It's moving east," Cal agreed. He looked toward the window. "Might have dropped some water on the ridge." Clara carefully folded Arthur's letter. She didn't put it away in a drawer. She slipped it into the pocket of her skirt. She was keeping it close, but she wasn't hiding it anymore. She took a deep breath. The air in the room felt lighter. The suffocating pressure that had been pressing down on the house since the banker's visit was gone. "Tomorrow," Clara said, her voice finding that familiar spark of determination, "we are going to need shovels and a pickaxe." Cal raised an eyebrow. "What for?" "Because if that map is right," Clara said, "there is water under the east parcel. And Harrison Vance is not going to get his hands on it. We are going to dig. We are going to find that aquifer." Cal looked at her. Her eyes were red, but the fire was back. A different kind of fire. It wasn't fueled by anger anymore. It was fueled by purpose. Cal felt a slow, genuine smile pull at the corner of his mouth. It felt strange, like a muscle he hadn't used in a long time. "The ground is like iron out there," Cal warned her. "It's going to be brutal work." "I'm not afraid of hard dirt," Clara said. She gave Buster a final pat and started to gather herself to stand. Cal stood up first. He offered his hand, not to pull a weak woman to her feet, but to help a partner up after a hard fall. Clara looked at his hand, the thick calluses, the old scars. She reached out and took it. Her grip was firm, strong. Cal pulled her up. They stood face to face for a moment. Two survivors in a quiet room, listening to the rain fall on a dying ranch. "Get some sleep, Clara," Cal said softly. "Dawn comes early." "Good night, Cal," she replied. Cal turned and walked out of the room. Buster followed him, the dog's limp a little less pronounced, his tail giving a lazy wag. When Cal finally lay back down on his cot, he listened to the steady rhythm of the rain. The hollow feeling in his chest was gone. It had been replaced by something heavy and solid and real. For the first time in 4 years, Silas Montgomery closed his eyes and drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. Morning came clean. The storm had blown itself out somewhere over the far ridge. The sky was the color of a robin's egg, pale, clear, washed empty of dust. Cal stepped off of the back porch. His boots sank an inch into the soft, sweet-smelling mud he breathed in. The air tasted like wet sage and ozone. For the first time in months, the prairie didn't smell like a graveyard. It smelled alive. He walked to the barn. The air was cool, but it wouldn't last. By noon, the Kansas sun would turn the wet earth into a steam bath. They had to move fast. Cal hitched the two geldings to the old buckboard wagon. The leather traces were stiff, but the horses seemed to have a new spark in them. They tossed their heads, snorted the cool air. Even Buster was moving better. The dog hobbled around the wagon wheels, sniffing at puddles, his tail keeping a steady, lazy beat. The screen door slapped shut. Cal looked up. Clara was walking across the yard. She wore a heavy canvas work shirt, trousers, thick leather boots. Her hair was braided tight and pinned up under a wide-brimmed felt hat. She carried two steaming tin cups of coffee. She handed one to Cal. "Sun's coming up," she said. "It is," Cal agreed. He took a sip. It was strong, black just the way he needed it. Wagon S hitched. I loaded the pickaxes, 3 shovels, a pry bar, and all the empty water barrels we have. Clara looked at the back of the wagon. "It's a heavy load." "It's going to be heavier work," Cal warned her. He looked her in the eye, no pity, just facts. The rain only softened the top 2 inches. Below that, it's hardpan, baked clay, and limestone. It's going to fight us for every inch. "I've fought worse," Clara said simply. She climbed up onto the wooden bench of the wagon. She didn't wait for him to offer a hand. Cal tied Buster to the tailgate with a long, loose rope so the dog could trot behind them. Then, Cal climbed up beside her and took the reins. He gave the leathers a flick. The wagon lurched forward. The wheels cut deep, wet tracks into the dirt as they headed east. They rode in silence for a long time. It wasn't a strange silence. The heavy, suffocating secret was gone. The truth was out in the open air, riding right there on the bench between them. Cal felt raw, like a man who had survived a terrible fever. He was weak, but he was breathing. He looked at the woman sitting next to him. He had killed her husband. He had lied, and a good man had died in a cold cell. By all the laws of the West, she should have put a bullet in his chest the day she arrived. Instead, she was riding out with him to dig a well, to save his land. It didn't make sense. It gnawed at him. The guilt hadn't vanished. It had just changed shape. It had turned into a desperate, aching need to understand. "Arthur drew the map," Cal said quietly, his eyes on the horses. He knew the water was there. He could have told the bank. He could have used it to buy his way out of trouble. Clara kept her eyes on the horizon. Arthur wasn't the kind of man to buy his life with dirt. He was a surveyor before he bought the ranch in Missouri. He loved the land. He understood it. He told me this valley wasn't dead. It was just waiting. "He was a good man," Cal said. The words tasted like ash. "He was?" Clara agreed. They reached the east parcel an hour later. It was a wide, sloping basin. A crown of ancient, stubborn cottonwood trees stood at the center. Their roots dug deep, holding on to a promise of water that the surface had forgotten. The grass here was a little thicker, a little less gray. Cal pulled back on the reins. The wagon rolled to a stop beneath the shade of the largest cottonwood. He pulled Arthur's map from his shirt pocket. He unfolded it carefully. He looked at the paper, then looked at the land. He paced off 20 yards from the trunk of the tree. He stopped. He dug his boot heel into the soft mud, drawing an X. "Here," Cal said. "Right here." Clara climbed down from the wagon. She walked to the back. She pulled out a heavy iron pickaxe. She carried it over to the X. Cal walked up beside her. He held out his hand. Let me start. It is going to jar your shoulders. Clara shook her head. We swing together, half and half. She raised the pickaxe high over her head. She brought it down with a sharp grunt. Thwack! The iron point bit through the wet topsoil and struck the hardpan below. The shock rippled up the wooden handle. Clara's teeth clicked together, but she didn't drop the tool. She pulled it loose, stepped back. Cal stepped up. He swung his pickaxe. Crack! A chunk of dry clay flew into the air. They fell into a rhythm. Cal. Then Clara. One swing after another. The sun climbed higher. The cool morning burned away. The humidity rose, thick and suffocating. Sweat poured down their faces. It stung their eyes. It soaked their shirts. By noon, they had a hole 4 feet across and 2 feet deep. It was nothing. A scratch on the surface of the earth. The ground below the mud was like solid concrete. Cal stopped. He leaned on the handle of his pickaxe. He was breathing hard. His chest heaved. He looked over at Clara. She was wiping her forehead with a dirty bandana. Her hands were blistered. Her face was pale from the heat, but she was reaching for her shovel to clear the loose dirt. Cal couldn't take it anymore. He dropped his pickaxe. The iron head hit the dirt with a heavy thud.
Clara stopped.
She looked at him. Why? Cal asked. The word was torn out of him. It was jagged, bleeding. Clara rested her hands on the top of her shovel. She didn't pretend not to understand. Cal, we talked about this last night. No, Cal said. He stepped closer to the edge of the hole. His voice was rising, thick with a desperate kind of anger. Not at her, at himself. We talked about my guilt. We talked about my cowardice. But we didn't talk about this, about you being here. About you swinging a pickaxe in the boiling sun to save the land of the man who ruined you. He pointed a shaking finger at his own chest. I don't deserve this, Cal said, his voice breaking. I don't deserve your help. I don't deserve your grace. By all rights, you should be standing over my grave, not digging a well with me. It doesn't make sense. Why did Arthur send you to me? Why didn't he send you to put a bullet in my head? The wind moved through the cottonwood leaves. A soft, dry rustle. Clara looked at him, really looked at him. She saw a man drowning in his own unworthiness. A man begging for a punishment he felt he hadn't fully received. She let go of the shovel. She stepped across the loose dirt. She walked right up to the edge of the hole, standing inches away from him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. When she spoke, every word was a hammer, striking an anvil. Sharp, permanent. Because Arthur was a better man than the system that killed him, Clara said. Cal stared at her. Arthur knew you were coerced, Clara said, holding his eyes. He sat in that courtroom, coughing his lungs out, and he watched you testify. He saw the marshals standing behind you. He saw the trap you were in. He knew you traded his life for your own. That makes it worse, Cal whispered. No, Claire said firmly. It makes it human. You were weak. You were afraid. But Arthur wrote to me from that cell. He wrote to me every week until he couldn't hold the pen anymore. She reached into her pocket. She didn't pull out a letter, but she touched the fabric where it sat. Arthur taught me something before the fever took him, Clara stated. Her voice was strong, carrying the absolute weight of a teacher, imparting a final, vital lesson. He told me that hatred is a prison, a darker, colder prison than the one they locked him in. Cal stood frozen. You think I am here, granting you a pardon, Clara said, stepping even closer. You think I am absolving you of your sins. I am not. She lifted her chin. The fire in her eyes was brilliant. Forgiveness isn't a gift I'm handing down to you, Cal, Clara declared, her words ringing out like a bell in the quiet valley. It is not a reward for your suffering. Forgiveness is my right. It is my right to free myself from the past. Cal opened his mouth, but no words came. If I spend the rest of my life hating you, Clara continued, her voice fierce and unyielding, then the men who forced you to lie win. The corruption wins. If I carry that vengeance, Arthur's death becomes a monument to cruelty. I refuse to let his memory be a weapon. She pointed to the hard, unyielding earth beneath their boots. You want to know why I'm digging? She asked. Because tearing down a guilty man is easy. Any fool with a gun can exact revenge. But building something, creating life out of a dry, dead place, that takes strength. Cal felt tears prick the corners of his eyes. Not tears of sorrow this time. Tears of profound, shattering awe. Compassion between people is the only weapon we have left, Clara said softly, but the words echoed in Cal's chest. It is the only thing that breaks the cycle of cruelty. You hurt Arthur. I could hurt you. Someone else could hurt me. The world just bleeds and bleeds. Unless someone has the courage to stop, to look at the person who wronged them and say, the violence ends with me. She looked down at the iron pickaxe lying in the dirt. Then she looked back up at his weathered, scarred face. Arthur sent me here to save you from yourself, Clara said, because he knew that if the law wouldn't give us justice, we had to create our own. And the only justice that actually matters, Cal, is redemption. She didn't wait for him to answer. Clara turned around. She walked back to her side of the hole. She picked up her shovel. She drove it into the loose dirt and threw a pile over her shoulder. Cal stood there. His hands were empty. His mind was reeling. The violence ends with me. He had spent his whole life enforcing the law. He had carried a gun, put men in chains, and believed that force was the only way to balance the scales. But standing here, covered in mud and sweat, he realized he had known nothing about true strength. True strength wasn't making a man bleed. True strength was looking at a broken world and choosing to plant a seed anyway. Clara was right. He didn't deserve her forgiveness. It wasn't something a man could earn. It was a choice she had made for her own soul. And because she had made that choice, Cal suddenly had a reason to live that had nothing to do with hiding. He had a debt to pay, not to the bank, not to the law, but to the memory of Arthur Boone and to the fierce, brilliant woman digging in the dirt beside him. Cal bent down. He wrapped his thick, calloused hands around the wooden handle of the pickaxe. The wood was warm from the sun. He stood up. He walked to the edge of the hard pan. He didn't swing with anger. He didn't swing with guilt. He raised the iron high over his head, took a deep breath of the hot Kansas air, and brought the pickaxe down with the focused, devastating power of a man who was finally fighting for the right side. Crack! A massive chunk of limestone shattered. Clara looked over. She didn't smile, but the hard line of her mouth softened. She stepped in with her shovel, scooping out the broken rock, clearing the way for his next strike. They didn't speak again for hours. They didn't need to. The rhythm returned. The swing, the strike, the clearing of the earth. It was a brutal, punishing dance. The sun beat down on their backs, baking the mud onto their clothes. Their muscles screamed. Their hands bled, but they didn't stop. Buster lay in the shade of the cottonwood tree, watching them. The dog rested his chin on his paws, his eyes tracking the rise and fall of the iron tools. Deep beneath the hard pan, buried under layers of ancient rock and dry clay, the water waited. It was cold, it was pure, and it was trapped. Cal swung the pickaxe again. He was going to break the rock. He was going to find the water. He was going to give Clara Boone the land she deserved, or he was going to die swinging the iron. For the first time in his life, Silas Montgomery wasn't afraid of the judgment to come. He welcomed it. Thwack, the dirt flew. The hole grew deeper, and slowly, inch by painful inch, the darkness of the past began to give way to the light. The digging was brutal. It was bone-breaking, blister-tearing work. For 3 days, Cal and Clara swung the iron pickaxes. They broke the hard pan. They shoveled the loose rock. The hole grew deeper, yard by agonizing yard. But time was moving faster than the shovels. It was the 28th of the month. 2 days left until Harrison Vance called in the debt. 2 days until the bank took the east parcel, the water, and any chance at a future. Carl woke up before dawn. His hands were stiff. The joints in his fingers throbbed. He sat on the edge of his cot and stared at his scarred knuckles. An apology was enough. Clara had made that clear. Sitting in the dark and feeling guilty didn't save a ranch. It didn't right a wrong. Cal stood up. He put on his only clean shirt. He strapped on his gun belt, not to use it, just to remind the town of Oakhaven who they were dealing with. He walked into the kitchen. Clara was already at the stove. Buster was at her feet, gnawing on a dry bone. She looked at Cal. She saw the gun. She saw the hard, flat look in his eyes. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Town?" Cal said. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out the map. Arthur map. "I'm buying us time." Clara wiped her hands on a towel. "Vance won't give you time. He wants the land." "He wants money," Cal corrected. "The land is just how he gets it." "I'll be back by noon. Keep digging. Don't go past the limestone shelf without me." He didn't wait for an argument. He walked out, saddled his horse, and rode hard for Oakhaven. The town was waking up when he arrived. The dust was already thick in the air. Cal hitched his horse outside the Oakhaven First National Bank, a brick building, cold and out of place on the dying prairie. He walked in. His spurs jingled, a heavy, rhythmic sound. The teller looked up, swallowed hard, and pointed to the back office. Harrison Vance was sitting behind a large mahogany desk. He had a ledger open, a cup of hot tea steaming next to his inkwell. He looked up. He smiled, that same slick, oily smile. "Montgomery," Vance said. He leaned back in his leather chair. "You're early. Brought the money?" "No," Cal said. He walked up to the desk. He didn't sit down. Vance sighed. He closed the ledger. "Then you brought the deed. A wise choice. Surrendering gracefully is a virtue." Cal reached into his shirt. He pulled out the map. He tossed it onto the polished mahogany. It landed with a soft, heavy slap. "Look at it," Cal ordered. Vance frowned. He reached out and unfolded the brittle paper. His eyes tracked the lines, the elevation marks, and then they stopped on the red circle, the aquifer. Vance's face didn't change, but his hand twitched, just a fraction. "A childish drawing," Vance said smoothly. "Worthless." "It's an artesian survey," Cal said. His voice was low, like gravel crushing under a wagon wheel. "Signed by Arthur Boone, the best surveyor in Missouri. You know it's real. That's why you want the east parcel. You don't want the grass. You want the water." Vance folded his hands on the desk. He dropped the smile. "And what if I do? You have no money to dig it. You have no collateral. The bank takes the land in 2 days, water and all." Cal leaned forward. He placed his massive, calloused hands flat on the desk. He looked right into Vance's eyes. The old marshal looked back out. "Because if you foreclose now," Cal said, "I will nail copies of this map to every telegraph pole from here to Kansas City. I'll tell every thirsty rancher in the valley that you knew about the water, and you let their cattle die just so you could steal the land cheap." Vance's jaw tightened. "You're bluffing." "Try me, Cal," whispered. "I've got nothing to lose. You have a board of directors. You cause a panic, they'll string you up by your gold watch chain." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. "What do you want?" Vance finally asked. 60 days, Cal said. an extension on the loan. 60 days to hit the water. When I hit it, the value of the ranch quadruples. I'll borrow against the new equity and pay off your $340 in cash. Vance calculated. His eyes darted across the desk. And if you dig for 60 days and find dust, then you get the land? Cal said, without a scandal. Vance picked up his pen. He dipped it in the inkwell. 60 days, Montgomery, not a minute more. Cal didn't smile. He just took the extension paper. But before he left the bank, he walked over to the county clerk's desk in the corner of the lobby. He asked for a blank property deed. He borrowed a pen. He wrote, carefully, deliberately. Then, he paid the clerk $2 to notarize the seal. Cal rode back to the ranch. The sun was high and blistering. He found Clara out at the east parcel. She was down in the hole, 6 feet deep now. She was swinging the pickaxe, her shirt soaked with sweat, her face streaked with gray limestone dust. Buster barked from the shade of the cottonwood tree. Clara stopped swinging. She looked up. Cal climbed down from his horse. He walked to the edge of the hole. He reached down and offered her his hand. She took it. He pulled her up over the edge. She was breathing hard. Did you get the time? Clara asked. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. Cal nodded. 60 days. Clara let out a long breath. Her shoulders dropped. Thank God. I got something else, too, Cal said. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out the folded legal paper. He held it out to her. Clara looked at the paper. She didn't take it. What is that? It's a deed, Cal said, to the east parcel. I had the clerk draft it this morning. I signed over full ownership of this 80 acres. The trees, the land, the water, all of it. Clara stared at him. She looked at the paper, then at his face. To who? To you, Cal said. Clara took a step back. The wind whipped a loose strand of hair across her face. No, I won't take your land, Cal. I didn't come here to rob you. It's not robbery, Cal said. He stepped forward. He held the paper out again. His hand was steady. His eyes were clear. Listen to me, Clara, Cal said. His voice was firm, completely devoid of self-pity. I'm not trying to buy your forgiveness with dirt. I know a piece of paper doesn't bring Arthur back. I know it doesn't erase what I did. He looked down at the deed, then back to her. But this society is built on stripping rights from women and the vulnerable. Cal stated, the words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. The men in those brick buildings, the lawmakers, the bankers, they build systems to keep women dependent, to keep you asking for permission to survive. Clara remained silent, her chest rising and falling from the heavy labor. This deed gives you back your autonomy, Cal said. He pressed the paper gently into her dirty, blistered hand. You are independent. You have the right to own property, and you are entirely free to determine your own life, with or without me. You can sell this land to Vance tomorrow and walk away a rich woman, or you can stay, but the choice is yours, not mine, not Arthur S. yours. Clara looked down at the heavy legal paper. Her name was written there in black ink. Clara Boone, sole owner. For years, she had been someone's daughter, then someone's wife, then a grieving widow. She had been defined by the men around her, defined by their choices, their mistakes, their deaths. Now, standing in the dirt of a dry Kansas ranch, a man was handing her the one thing the world had always denied her: power, real, tangible power over her own fate. Her hands trembled, just slightly. She looked up at Cal. He wasn't looking at her with expectation. He wasn't waiting for gratitude. He had simply balanced the scales the only way he knew how. Clara slowly folded the paper. You're a stubborn man, Silas Montgomery, Clara said softly. I've been told, Cal replied. Clara walked over to her saddlebag hanging from the wagon. She unbuckled the leather strap.
Place the deed inside.
next to Arthur S. letters. She buckled it back up. She turned around and walked back to the edge of the well. I accept the deed, Clara said, but I'm not selling, and I'm not leaving. She picked up her shovel. You gave me the right to choose, Clara said, looking him dead in the eye, and I am choosing to dig. We have 58 days left to find water. Pick up your iron, Cal. We have work to do. Cal felt a strange, tight knot in his chest loosen, a knot he hadn't even realized was there. He smiled, a real, genuine smile. Yes, ma'am, Cal said. He picked up his pickaxe, he jumped down into the hole, and together, as equals, they went back to work. The days blurred together. Sunlight, sweat, the ringing of iron against stone. It was day 42. The hole was 15 feet deep. It wasn't a hole anymore. It was a well. Cal had built a wooden tripod over the top, rigged with a heavy hemp rope and an iron bucket. One person dug at the bottom. The other hauled the dirt to the top. The heat inside the well was stifling. It smelled like crushed minerals and ancient, damp earth. Cal was at the bottom. He swung the pickaxe. His muscles burned with a dull, constant ache. He was exhausted. They were eating half rations to make the supplies last. The horses were skinny again. Buster spent all day sleeping in the shade, too tired to even chase the barn mice. Crack! Cal's pickaxe bounced off a solid layer of gray slate. The shock sent a sharp pain shooting up his forearms. He leaned against the dirt wall, gasping for air. He wiped his face with a filthy rag. Bucket's coming down.
Clara.
S voice echoed from above. The wooden bucket lowered into the gloom. Cal shoveled the broken slate into it. He tugged the rope twice. Haul away. He watched the bucket rise toward the circle of blue sky above. He watched a silhouette as she strained against the rope, her boots braced on the edge, pulling the heavy load up hand over hand. She was magnificent. Cal realized it with a sudden quiet clarity. He wasn't just grateful to her. He didn't just respect her. He was falling in love with her. He loved the way she refused to back down. He loved the way she spoke the truth, no matter how much it hurt. He loved the absolute, unbreakable strength in her spine. But he knew he couldn't say it. He had given her autonomy. He wouldn't trap her with his own feelings. He was a man trying to make amends, not a man looking for a prize. Coming down, Clara called out. She didn't send the bucket this time. She climbed down the rope ladder they had secured to the tripod. She reached the bottom, her boots landing softly on the slate. She brought a canteen of water. She handed it to Cal. He drank. The water was warm and tasted like tin, but it was the best thing he had ever swallowed. Clara leaned against the wall next to him. In the cramped, dark arc space of the well, they were inches apart. Their shoulders brushed. Slate, Clara noted, looking at the floor. It thick, Cal said, his breathing heavy. Might be 3 feet, might be 10. If we don't break through it soon, we won't have the strength left to haul the rock out. Clara didn't look discouraged. She just looked thoughtful. I need to tell you something, Clara said quietly. The acoustics of the well made her voice sound close, intimate. Cal turned his head to look at her. What is it? Clara looked down at her muddy boots. That first week, when I arrived at the ranch, I told you I stayed because of Arthur's letter, because he asked me to find you. I remember, Cal said. It was the truth, Clara continued, but it wasn't the whole truth. She looked up. Her eyes met his in the dim light. I was empty, Cal, Clara confessed. When Arthur died, a part of me died in that cell with him. I spent 2 years sitting in a nice house in Missouri, surrounded by nice things, and I was entirely dead inside. I came out west looking for the man who ruined my life. I think I wanted to find a monster. Cal swallowed hard. You found a coward instead. No, Clara said softly. I found a man who was hurting just as much as I was. When I saw you stand up to that drifter, when I saw you give Buster a place on your porch, I saw a man who was drowning in his own regret. She reached out. Her fingers lightly brushed the dust from the sleeve of his shirt. I didn't stay just to honor my husband, Clara said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I stayed because I needed a purpose. I stayed because watching you try to fix this broken ranch made me feel like maybe I could fix myself. I needed you, Cal, just as much as you needed me. Cal couldn't speak. His heart was hammering against his ribs, not from the labor, from the sheer, raw honesty of the woman standing beside him. He wanted to reach out. He wanted to pull her close. But he kept his hands at his sides. We fix it together, Cal finally managed to say. Clara smiled. A soft, beautiful smile in the dark. Yes, she said. Together. Now give me the iron. It's my turn to swing. Cal handed her the pickaxe. He stepped back. Clara raised the heavy tool. She adjusted her grip. She took a deep breath, focusing all her strength on a small fault line in the gray slate floor. She brought the iron down with everything she had left. Crack. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. It didn't sound like breaking rock. It sounded like a gunshot. The iron point drove deep into the slate. Clara went to pull it out for another swing, but the pickaxe was stuck. It's wedged, Clara grunted, pulling on the wooden handle. Cal stepped forward to help her. He grabbed the handle above her hands. They pulled together. Suddenly, a loud, wet hiss echoed from the floor. Cal froze. Wait. He let go of the handle. He dropped to his knees. He placed his hand flat against the slate, right next to where the iron had pierced the stone. The rock was vibrating. It was cold. Ice cold. Clara, Cal whispered. He looked up at her, his eyes wide. Pull it out. Fast. Clara braced her boots. She gave a massive heave. The pickaxe popped loose. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the slate fractured. A web of cracks shot out from the hole. The hissing grew louder. Boom. A chunk of slate the size of a dinner plate blew upward. Water erupted from the earth. It wasn't a trickle, it was a geyser. The artesian pressure, trapped beneath the rock for centuries, exploded upward with terrifying force. A thick, muddy column of freezing water blasted into the air, soaking them both instantly. Get to the rope, Cal yelled over the roar of the water. The well was filling fast. The bottom turned into a churning pool of mud and water. It was around their ankles, then their calves. Clara grabbed the rope ladder. She scrambled up, her boots slipping on the wet rungs. Cal was right behind her. The water chased them up the shaft. They reached the top. Cal grabbed Clara by the waist and hauled her over the edge onto the muddy grass. They collapsed side by side, gasping for air. From the hole, the sound of rushing water echoed like a runaway train. Cal scrambled to his hands and knees. He crawled to the edge and looked down. The water was rising. It was clearing out the mud, turning from brown to a deep, crystal blue. It was filling the 15-foot shaft. The pressure was incredible. It wasn't just a well. It was a massive living spring. Arthur S. Mapp was right. Cal fell back onto the grass. He started to laugh. It was a wild, joyous sound. The sound of a man who had just outrun the devil. Clara sat up. She was soaked to the bone. Her hair had come undone, hanging in wet, heavy strands around her shoulders. She looked at the water spilling over the lip of the well, soaking into the dry dirt of the east parcel. She looked at Cal. He was laughing. His face tipped up toward the sky. Clara started to laugh, too. Buster ran over, barking frantically, jumping around them and snapping at the water spraying from the well. They stood up. They were covered in mud, freezing cold, exhausted. But they were alive, and the land was alive. Clara walked over to Cal. She didn't hesitate. Sh- She reached out and took both of his large, calloused hands in hers. Cal stopped laughing. He looked down at her. The air between them suddenly felt charged with something heavier than the water. "Look at it," Clara said. She nodded toward the spring. "It's beautiful," Cal said, but he was looking at her. "This land dried up because it was ruled by force and fear," Clara said, her voice clear and strong over the sound of the rushing water. She squeezed his hands tightly. For years, it was managed by men who thought they could choke the life out of things to control them. Clara told him, her eyes locking onto his. "Now it's reviving because we worked it together as equals. Not as a boss and a hired hand. Not as a man and a dependent." Cal listened, his heart full to bursting. "Equality is the only thing that works, Cal," Clara stated, stating the absolute truth of their survival. Mutual respect is the only underground spring that can sustain any relationship. We didn't find this water because we fought each other. We found it because we stood shoulder to shoulder and struck the same stone. Cal slowly brought her hands up. He pressed them gently against his chest, right over his beating heart. "Shoulder to shoulder," Cal repeated softly. He didn't pull her into a desperate embrace. He didn't claim her. He just stood there, holding the hands of his equal, feeling the cold water run over their boots and sink into the earth. The debt was paid, the land was saved. And for the first time in his life, Silas Montgomery finally understood what it meant to be truly free. It was September. The air was crisp. It didn't burn your lungs anymore. The east parcel was green, not just a pale, dusty green. It was thick, rich. The sweet grass grew tall, swaying like an ocean in the west wind. The water had changed everything. The Montgomery Ranch wasn't dying. It was breathing. It was alive. The deep artesian spring flowed steady and cold, filling the troughs, soaking the soil, washing away the dust of 4 bitter years. Buster lay on the front porch. He was a different dog. He still had the limp. The crushed leg would never heal straight, but his ribs didn't show anymore. His coat was thick, the color of wet river stones. He lifted his head. He watched Cal and Clara walk across the yard. He gave a soft woof, thumped his tail, and went back to sleep in the sun. He didn't need to guard them anymore. There was nothing left to fear. Cal hitched the wagon. He didn't wear his gun belt. He had cleaned it, oiled it, and locked it in a trunk at the foot of his bed. He didn't need to be a marshal. He just needed to be a man. Clara walked out of the house. She wore a simple blue dress, no frills, just clean cotton. Her face was tanned from the summer sun. Her eyes were bright. Cal held out his hand. Clara took it. She stepped up onto the wagon bench. "Ready?" Cal asked. "I am," Clara said. Cal flicked the reins. The horses pulled forward. They rode into Oakhaven. The town looked different to Cal now. For years, it had felt like a jury box, a place full of eyes judging him. Now, it just looked like a town. Wooden buildings, dusty streets, people trying to get by. They pulled up to the county courthouse, a squat brick building right next to the bank. They walked inside. The air was stuffy. It smelled of ink, old paper, and stale cigar smoke. Judge Henry Higgins sat behind a high wooden desk. He was a stern man, white hair, thick spectacles, and a worldview that hadn't changed since the Civil War. He looked down at the paperwork Cal had placed on the desk. It was a joint deed, a legal merging of the east parcel and the main ranch, full, equal ownership. In Kansas, in 1878, a man and a woman signing a joint property deed was as binding as any church vow. It was a marriage of dirt and ink. Judge Higgins frowned. He pushed his spectacles up his nose. He looked at Clara. Then he glared at Cal. "Montgomery, the judge grumbled, his voice dripping with condescension. I know you've had a hard few years, but putting a woman on the deed to a working cattle ranch as a 50% owner, that ain't just unusual, it's as foolish. The judge leaned forward, tapping his pen on the wood. A woman places keeping this hearth, the judge lectured, not managing the capital. It causes confusion in the household when the wife thinks she holds the reins. You give a woman legal claim to the dirt, she's going to start thinking she has a say in how you run your life. Cal didn't get angry. He didn't clench his fists. He didn't need to intimidate the old man. Cal simply placed his large, scarred hands flat on the edge of the judge's desk. He looked Henry Higgins dead in the eye. Judge, Cal said. His voice was calm, but it carried the absolute weight of a man who knew the truth. You are looking at the world backwards. The judge blinked, taken aback. Cal looked at Clara. She stood beside him, her expression perfectly serene. Cal looked back to the judge. My wife is an equal owner, Cal stated clearly, making sure his voice carried through the quiet courthouse. In my house and on my land, there is no gender divide. A marriage built on ownership and control is just another kind of prison. The clerk in the corner stopped typing. The room went dead silent. Every decision on this land is made on the mutual consent of two free individuals. Cal continued, his words precise and unyielding. Women are not property. They are not dependents. If society says a woman is too fragile to hold a deed or too emotional to hold a bank account, then society is telling a lie to protect its own power. He pointed a finger at the legal document. Sign the paper, Judge, Cal ordered softly, because true partnership only exists when both people hold the keys to the front gate. I don't want a dependent. I want a partner. Judge Higgins opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the hard, unmovable set of Cal's jaw. Then he looked at Clara, who was staring back at him with an iron gaze that made the old judge sweat. Higgins grabbed his pen. He dipped it in the inkwell. He signed the paper. He brought down the heavy iron notary stamp. Thud. He slid the paper across the desk. Clara took the pen. She signed her name, smooth, elegant. She handed the pen to Cal. He signed his name right beside hers. The ink bled together in the center of the page. No fancy rings, no preacher. Just two people swearing to share the burden and the bounty of the earth as equals. They walked out of the courthouse. The midday sun was warm. You give a good speech, Silas Montgomery, Clara said. A small teasing smile played at the corner of her mouth. I just stated the facts, Cal said. He tipped his hat to her. Partner, partner, Clara agreed. 6 moves later, spring 1879. The herd was growing. They had bought 20 head of healthy fat cattle from a rancher up north. They needed a bigger barn. It was early morning. The prairie was covered in a soft, silvered dew. Cal was out back, near the old corral. He had a shovel. He was digging the trench for the new barn's stone foundation. The earth was soft now, rich and dark. It yielded easily to the iron blade. Cal drove the shovel down with his clink. It wasn't a rock. It sounded hollow, metallic. Cal stopped. He leaned the shovel against his leg. He dropped to his knees in the dirt. He dug into the loose soil with his bare hands. About 2 feet down, his fingers brushed against cold metal. He pulled it out. It was a tin box, small, covered in rust and caked in mud. It looked. Cal, he looked up. Clara was walking across the yard. She carried a tin pitcher of cold water and 2 cups. She saw him kneeling in the dirt, holding the box. She hurried over. What did you find? Clara asked, setting the pitcher down. I don't know, Cal said. He brushed the dirt off the lid. The hinges were solid. Cal pulled his pocket knife from his trousers. He wedged the thick blade under the lid and twisted hard. The rust gave way with a sharp snap. The lid popped open. Inside, the tin was dry. Lying on the bottom, wrapped in a piece of yellowed, brittle oilcloth, was a ring, a simple brass band, tarnished green with age. Beneath the ring was a folded piece of paper. Cal wiped his hands on his trousers. He reached in and carefully pulled the paper out. It felt like dry leaves. He unfolded it. The ink was faded to a pale brown, but the cursive handwriting was tight and legible. He handed the paper to Clara. "You read it," Cal said. "My eyes aren't what they used to be." Clara took the delicate paper. She looked at the date at the top. She gasped softly. "May 14th. Clara read aloud, 1861. 18 years ago, the dawn of the Civil War. "Read it," Cal urged softly. Clara cleared her throat. She held the paper steady in the morning breeze. She read the words left behind by the ghosts of the prairie. "To whoever finds this," Clara read, "my name is James Calloway. My wife, Eleanor, and I are leaving. The war has come. We cannot hold this land. We are burying this box as a promise to the earth, a confession of my foolishness." Clara stopped. She looked at Cackle. "Go on," Cal said. "I tried to break this land." Clara read, her voice growing stronger, carrying the heavy truth of the words. "I tried to force it to yield. I worked my wife to the bone, treating her as a laborer in my kingdom, ignoring her voice because I believed a man must rule alone, and the land dried up. My pride almost killed us both." Clarissa's voice hitched slightly. She took a breath and continued. "It was Eleanor who found the water," Clara read. "It was Eleanor who taught me the final lesson of the West." Clara looked up. She held the paper tight. She looked at the green grass. She looked at the water trough. Then she looked at the man kneeling in front of her. "He wrote the lesson down," Clara said. She looked back at the paper. She read the final lines. She didn't just read them, she declared them. "The land does not belong to the strongest man," Clara read. "The educational value of the pioneer assess," words ringing absolute and clear. "The land belongs to those who understand it. You cannot conquer nature, just as you cannot conquer a spouse. You must work in harmony. A house divided by inequality will starve. But a house where a man and a woman stand shoulder to shoulder with equal voice, equal labor, and equal worth will bear fruit for generations." Clara lowered the paper. The sentence ended there. The silence in the valley was profound. The ghosts of James and Eleanor Calloway lingered in the morning air. A love story interrupted by war. A lesson buried in the dirt, waiting for someone wise enough to unearth it. Cal looked at the rusted brass ring in the tin box. He looked at the sprawling ranch, the thriving cattle, the fat dogs sleeping on the porch. Then he looked at Clara. "They figured it out," Cal said quietly. "They did," Clara agreed, folding the delicate paper and tucking it safely into her apron pocket. "They just ran out of time." Cal stood up. He brushed the dark soil from his knees. "We have time," Cal said. He didn't ask her to wear the brass ring. He didn't make a grand, dramatic show of it. The ring belonged to the past. They belonged to the future. Cal simply closed the tin box and set it gently on a nearby fence post. A monument. A reminder of the truth they already lived. "We have a barn to build," Cal said. They walked over to the stack of fresh-cut pine, thick, heavy timber for the main framing. In the old days, Cal would have dragged the timber himself. He would have broken his back trying to prove he was strong enough to carry the world alone. Clara would have been inside, watching through the window. Not today. Cal walked to one end of the heavy wooden beam. Clara walked to the other end. Cal looked at her. He nodded. "On three," Clara said. "1, 2, 3. Cal counted. Together they lifted. The timber was incredibly heavy, but shared between them, the weight was manageable. They carried the heavy beam across the wet grass. They set it down gently onto the new stone foundation. Cal reached into his leather pouch. He pulled out 2 iron hammers. He kept one. He handed the other across the timber to Clara. They stood on opposite sides of the beam. The Kansas sun was warm on their backs. The wind blew from the west, carrying the sweet smell of the artesian spring. They raised their hammers. They looked at each other, sharing a quiet, unbreakable smile. And side by side, as absolute equals, they began to build. This story reminds us that every human being deserves dignity, compassion, and the opportunity to change. True courage is not revenge, it is choosing kindness when hatred would be easier. If this story moved you, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Join us for more unforgettable journeys across the Old West. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.
When the dust finally settles over the Kansas prairie, this story leaves us with something far greater than the memory of a ranch, a hidden well, or a broken man seeking redemption. It reminds us that every human life carries a weight that cannot be measured by money, power, or pride. Cal Montgomery once believed that survival meant protecting himself at any cost, even if another man had to suffer for it. But through Clara Boone's courage, mercy, and quiet strength, he learned that a man is not redeemed by regret alone. He is redeemed by truth, by accountability, and by the willingness to spend the rest of his life doing what is right. Clara's forgiveness was not weakness. It was not surrender. It was the strongest choice a wounded heart could make. She proved that hatred can keep a soul chained to the past, while compassion can open a door toward healing. And Cal proved that even a person who has fallen into shame can still rise again if he has the courage to face the truth and change through action. The meaning of this story is simple, but deeply human. We cannot undo the pain we have caused, but we can choose what kind of person we become after the truth is revealed. We can keep running from guilt, or we can stand still, face it, and build something better from the broken ground beneath our feet. In the harsh world of the Old West, where guns often spoke louder than hearts, this story shows us that the greatest strength is mercy. The greatest justice is redemption, and the greatest victory is learning to become human again. So may this tale stay with you as a reminder to treat every living soul with dignity, to never mistake kindness for weakness, and to believe that even in the driest season of life, hope may still be waiting beneath the hard rock.